Meditations of my heart and my mind be acceptable to you, gracious and loving God. Allow me to be an instrument of your will, your peace, and your love. That meeting on Thursday was very interesting, actually I'm hoping that Zach Law, who's the assistant to the bishop, will be here. He's a pastor of a church in Berks County, Boone, and I invited him, and also Brian Beisel, who's the pastor at St. Peter's in Pine Grove. Always room for a couple more. We listen to what's in our passage today. There's always room for one more, always. Approximately 150 years ago, a 16-year-old boy walked several hundred miles to the Hampton Institute, I think it's in Virginia, where he wanted to go to school. According to the National Park Service, he arrived there with 50 cents in his pocket. He didn't make a very good impression at all. He was later quoted as saying, "Having so long without proper food, a bath, and a change of clothing, I did not make a very favorable impression upon her," meaning the head teacher. And I could see at once there were doubts in her mind. After he presented his case, there was silence. And then she responded, "The adjoining reception room needs cleaning. Take the broom and do it." Perhaps another person would have been insulted, but this young man wasn't. He went into the other room and cleaned and recleaned to make sure it was perfect. And when it was completed, the lead teacher examined the room with utmost care, taking her cloth, checking for dust everywhere. And finding no dust, she said, "I guess you will do to enter this institution." After passing this admission exam, Booker T. Washington, born into slavery, was accepted into the school. You know the rest of the story. The young man couldn't do many things, and he had nothing or little to offer, only himself. However, he was able to clean the room, and he did it with joy. He did it with joy. I'm sure those people that work here, hopefully, do their work with joy. Extraordinary living begins with ordinary gifts. He did clean the rooms. He was, for the whole way, he was in there. It's a way of his paying his way. What graces do you have that you haven't shared? What gifts do you have that you haven't shared? In doing my research for today's sermon, I ran across a story about a young man who wanted to help Albert Schweitzer. He wanted to send him medication. He had heard that they were in need of medication years in the early 50s, and Albert was rather active in Africa, setting up hospitals and so forth. The boy didn't have much money at all. And he got enough together, he bought a bottle of aspirin. He wrote a letter to the Air Force, and somebody got a hold of the letter and it was published. And in the end, after the media found the story and published it, the response was overwhelming. Thousands of dollars and tons of medicine were given for this project. It would be the equivalent of millions of dollars today. When Dr. Schweitzer heard this story, he said, "I never thought one child could do so much." Now, I tried to find the source of this story, however, I wasn't able to. I looked and looked. I don't know if it's a valid story or not, but the message is there. The message is there. The point is not the size of the gift, but rather the spirit that's given. Additionally, how one person can make a dramatic change and have tremendous impact in the lives of others. So while looking for information on the validity of this story, I came across an article and photographs from the 1954 issue of Life magazine. You remember that? Okay. It was a great magazine. There was a photographer there. There was one photograph. There was a controversy about this one photograph, and I forgot to bring it. I made a copy of it. There's Albert sitting there in this photograph by Eugene. The photographer was a fellow by the name of Eugene Smith. And the controversy around that photograph is it wasn't real. Even back in the 1950s, they sort of altered pictures. Even before computers, they altered things. And he did, which apparently very few people did at that time. He did his own developing. Well, many people did that, but he took two negatives and somehow put them together. So here's Albert on the original, no arm up there, but on the one that was in Life magazine, there he is with his arm and hand up there. That was somehow superimposed on that. Even 70 years ago, there was controversies. Well, I found this interesting. I found the caption under a couple of photographs very interesting and intriguing. They offered insight into Albert Schweitzer, his way of thinking, and a lesson in being frugal, being good stewards of our resources. The captions, the shoes, quote, his shoes for muddy, rainy seasons were nearly 30 years old. Not many of us have shoes from 30 years old that we're still wearing. And the other one, frugal habits marked Schweitzer's life. He opened up and used envelopes for manuscript paper. Opened envelopes and used them for manuscript paper. And he punched holes in them with old nails. Frugality in the service of others. Our gospel reading today is about a young man who didn't have a whole lot. He didn't have a whole lot. However, what he did have, he offered to Jesus and to others. And in the end, thousands of people were fed. The event took place over Passover, approximately a year before Jesus' crucifixion, the crucifixion of Jesus. The Passover crowds were in all probability going to Jerusalem. That's one of the reasons why there were so many people there. Jesus did not go to Jerusalem for the Passover that year, and probably the first time since he was 12 years old that he didn't go to Jerusalem for the Passover. The year before, he became aware of the fact that they were plotting to kill him, so he didn't return. This story is although there are some differences, this is the only pre-crucifixion event or sign that is recorded in all four Gospels. Probably indicates the significance of this event. The readings start making references to Jesus different ways. The readings start making references to Jesus becoming aware of the death of John the Baptist. Mark and Luke make reference to the disciples returning from their journey, their 6th and 8th month journey, spreading the good news, telling Jesus what they had accomplished in those months. In the Gospel of John, it starts with Jesus crossing the Lake of Galilee. This is what the crowds followed him and the disciples, meeting him when they arrived on the other shore. Jesus, having compassion, and after healing and performing other miracles, other healing things, told the disciples to provide food for them. They responded that they had none except 5 loaves and 2 fish. Only the Gospel of John states only the Gospel of John states. Andrew, who was Simon Peter's brother, said, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but they will certainly not be enough for all these people." Jesus tells his disciples to have the people sit, and according to Mark, in groups, in rows of 50 and 100. After looking up to heaven and giving thanks to God, Jesus broke the bread and distributed it to his disciples, who served it to all present. It's through this miracle that 5,000 followers, not counting women and children, were fed. Jesus, being somewhat frugal, I think was kind of frugal, he gathered up the remains. And from 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, there were 12 baskets that were gathered up. Pretty interesting. Many people who read this passage over the centuries have asked the question, did it really happen? Did it really happen? It sounds unbelievable. However, in my mind, to be a miracle, it's got to be unbelievable. Okay, if it was believable, it would be a miracle. Over the many years, there have been times that they have tried to explain this miracle. One person thought they were probably moved. People were so moved by the generosity of Jesus. They so cared and loved him that they had food with them already, and they pulled it out and shared it with everybody else. Who knows? Another story states this passage is really not about food. It's not physical hunger, but spiritual hunger. When the small amount of food was offered, the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, each person tore off a minuscule portion, just a little tiny bit. And in this way, it can be said that Jesus satisfied the hunger of 5,000 souls, if not their bodies. Actually, these questions and alternative explorations say more about us than they do Jesus. Always looking for an explanation. If we believe that Jesus is the Messiah, if we have faith that all things are possible, then there's no question. There's no question that this occurred, along with many other miracles. However, the point of the story of feeding the 5,000 is not to prove that miracles happened or it didn't happen. Rather, the point of the story is to teach us 3 things. 3 things. The first is, Jesus is the fulfillment of the word. Second, we are to serve at the table of the Lord. And we can use our ability in service. Imagine looking at our Lutheran cluster dinners that we have here, 75, 80 people we feed is quite an undertaking. It's great. It's wonderful. Remember the Sunday school picnics of years ago where probably, from what I understand, hundreds of people were fed. Compare those numbers to feeding 5,000 people, not including women and children. Even in the time of Jesus, there were detractors pointing out that the meal of Jesus may have been impressive, but there's only one meal. There's only one meal. I mean, they compared it to Moses. He led Israel in the wilderness for 40 years. 40 years. And provided meals for them. There was an expectation that the Messiah would cause manna to fall from the heavens as Moses did. Yes, this solved their physical needs, but not their spiritual needs. Jesus corrected this misinterpretation. He referred to the manna as given by God, not Moses, and how it was to be called the bread of God. To be fair, there were those in great faith that thought Jesus must be the Messiah promised by Moses in Deuteronomy, and believed. In fact, it was stated that people were so impressed and overcome with this miracle that they wanted to enthrone him as king. They were still on that idea that the Messiah was going to be a political person, a king. They were going to do it right on the spot. But Jesus quickly left because he was fearful of what they wanted. It was not part of the plan. You'll notice that the disciples, at the request of Jesus, served the multitudes. Served the multitudes. And after people ate, the disciples gathered up the remains. The life of Jesus and the life and the message he instilled in his disciples was a way of life of service, a life of service to others. It's the same message that he gives us today. It's a message to serve others. It may be a life of service with benefits. Might be. If we look at the story of Booker T, certainly he got his education by his service. Pastors do service. They get paid. There's some benefit there. In fact, Booker T paid for his way through Hampton by cleaning and serving others. Actually, his whole life was service to others. His whole life was in service to others. And it really doesn't matter what we have or how small or big it is. It doesn't matter. This is illustrated in this young story that wanted to send some medication to Albert Schweitzer. According to the story that's unverified, I have to repeat that again, but the money that he saved, he bought 1 bottle of aspirin. In the end, though, his small act, a tremendous amount was provided for the hospital in Africa, Albert Schweitzer's hospital. As Wilfred Peterson states in his book, The Art of Living, small things can be very powerful. Small things can be very powerful. Things like words. Words of encouragement, words of kindness, words of inspiration, words of guidance. We can all give those gifts. There are also gifts of the heart. Love, joy, understanding, sympathy, tolerance, and forgiveness. There's also gifts of the minds. Ideas, dreams, ideals, principles, projects, poetry, gifts of the Spirit, prayer, vision, beauty, aspiration, peace, and faith. And there are gifts of our time in service to others. I understand that yesterday the parking lot was, I don't know, full or partly full or whatnot. Church was asked to, if someone could use the parking lot because they're doing a project down the street on someone's house. And the answer was yes, you could use that. It's a small gift, letting them use the parking lot. But nevertheless, it's a gift. It's a gift. And we all have those small gifts. It's not the size. It's the spirit. That the gift is given with joy. Although, according to Emerson and Peterson, gifts of things are apologies for gifts. The only true gift is a portion of thyself. The things mentioned above, in the 2 stories that I related, and those words that I talked about, gifts of the mind, gifts of words, and so forth, they're portions of each one of us. If we're going to share. And while these stories illustrate the concept of sharing, the concept of true gifts, nothing illustrates as more. in the life and death of Jesus. A life and a death in service to others. A gift to each one.